Okay. Welcome everyone to Journeys to the Books of the Prophets. We're in the book of Judges, Shoftim. Tonight we are doing 4 chapters, chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. The first 2 chapters are, I would say, not among the most famous parts of Judges. And the second part is a more well-known story that happens. So we're going to start in chapter 9. And as always, we're doing a review. We can't do verse by verse. Here, we ended chapter 8. The previous class was all about Gidon. Gidon, who led this miraculous victory over our enemies. You remember, with just 300 men, he was able to defeat an entire army. And the book ended that Gidon, he became the leader of the generation, even though, if you remember, the people came and said, "You rule over us. You and your son will rule after you, and your son's son will rule after you." And Gidon, which was very part of who he was, said, "I will not rule over you, and my son won't rule over you. God will rule over you." Now remember, someone made the comment, this is very similar to Shmuel, Samuel, when Israel asked for a king. He made it very, very clear that the real king is Melech Malchei Amlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. And the last chapter ends that the people of Israel did not do well by Gidon, despite all of the kindnesses and victories and success that he had. That's how it ended. This chapter 9 begins with the idea that Gidon, it's actually mentioned in the previous chapter, he had 70 sons. He had many wives, and he had 70 sons. And he also had, they're not named, but he had also a concubine with whom he had a son, and his name was Avimelech. So this chapter 9 begins that Avimelech lived in Shechem. The rest of the brothers lived in a different place. And he alone was in Shechem. That's where this concubine was. So after Gidon dies and all the sons grow up, Avimelech comes to the people of Shechem and says, "You should make me king over you. I'm from Shechem. Why would you turn to any of the 70 sons of Gidon? I'm your flesh and blood. I'm from Shechem." So the people agreed, and they made Avimelech king over them, and they gave him 70 pieces of silver or gold. And I have to say, this is a very horrible thing that happens. Avimelech took that money and he hired, we'll call them assassins for hire. And he and this unruly group went and they killed all 70 of Gidon's sons. It's a terrible incident. They had done nothing to him. but he obviously had an insatiable desire to rule, and he kills all of the sons of Gidon except one who hid away. He would have killed him also, and his name was Yotam. So starting in approximately verse 6, Yotam goes and he stands on Har Grizim. Now, we've talked about these two mountains many times, Har Eval and Har Grizim. This is where the blessing and curse was pronounced. When Israel came into the land, Yeshua led them, because in the book of Devarim, it says that when you enter to the land, you should go to these two mountains and you should renew the covenant with God. And they did so through an elaborate ritual of pronouncing blessings and curses. All the curses were pronounced in Har Eval and the blessings in Har Grizim. Now, it turns out that the city of Shechem sits under, right next to these two mountains. So Yotam, who is the only son of Gidon who is left, he goes to Har Grizim, overlooking the city of Shechem, and he pronounces a parable. And the whole parable is written out here. And the parable is something like this, that all the trees wanted to anoint a king over themselves. So they came to the olive tree and said, "You should rule over us." And the olive tree said, "I have it so good. Why should I bother ruling over you? I'm perfectly happy the way I am." Then they went to a fig tree. Again, this is a parable. And Yotam obviously is saying this in a very loud voice to the people of Shechem who have anointed Avimelech, who just went and slaughtered all of the sons of Gidon. And in the parable, they come and say to the trees say to the fig tree, "You rule over us." The fig tree says, "My fruit is so sweet. Why should I bother ruling over? I'm perfectly happy the way I am." And then it comes to a grapevine. "Grapevine, you rule over us." And the grapevine says, "Why should I leave the wine that I make to take time to rule over the other trees?" And then Yotam says that all the trees came to a bramble bush, like a thorn bush, not even like an established tree, a thorn bush, and said, "You reign over us." And so here Yotam says, the bramble bush answers back and says, "If you want me to be king over you, and you put your trust in me, then all will be good. And if not, from the bramble bush will come out a fire and destroy all of you." So here, this is a parable. So he continues and he says, if you have made Avimelech king over you, and you've sworn your loyalty to him, and you have ignored what my father Gidon did for you. He saved all of Israel. And here you've put your faith in Avimelech. And I'm telling you that a fire is going to come out of this bramble and destroy all of you. And Yotam ran away. So they couldn't catch him. So this is the parable that Yotam says. In other words, he's warning them, you've put all your faith in Avimelech, it's going to come back to haunt you. So sure enough, right after that, it says that the people of Shechem kind of got tired of Avimelech and they wanted to overthrow him. They dealt treacherously with him. And then a new person comes on the scene. His name was Gaal, and he was the son of Eved. And he comes to the people of Shechem and says, put your faith in me. I'll get rid of Avimelech. And there's a lot of details here that Avimelech hears. There's like a new guy in town who's going to get the people of Shechem to revolt against him. And many, many details here, but Avimelech ends up fighting Gaal. And in the end, Avimelech is actually successful. And he defeats Gaal and the people from Shechem who went with Gaal. And then Avimelech is back on top now. At first, the people of Shechem wanted to overturn him. But here, he was on top. And then he goes back to Shechem, and the people who had rebelled against him went into this tower, and Avimelech sets the tower on fire, and it says 1,000 men and women died. And then Avimelech went to a different city, and here he also caught the people in a tower. And here again, he was going to burn them all alive. And it says that a woman who was on the top of the tower pushed over a stone. It fell on Avimelech, and it didn't kill him, but it injured him to the point that he understood that he might not live. And so Avimelech turned to one of his weapons bearer, and he said, put a sword through me, so people won't say that Avimelech was killed by a woman. So here, this reminds us of two different things. A few chapters ago in the whole story of Devorah, when Barak said, I won't go to war without you, Devorah. And Devorah said, I'll go, but it won't be good for your reputation that you were afraid to fight the war without me. And then, of course, it was Yael who finished off Sisera. But it also reminds us of the story that eventually we'll get to, when Shaul is defeated in battle by the Philistines, and he is mortally injured, and he asks that his arms bearer also puts a sword through him. But here, it had nothing to do with a woman. He didn't want to be captured. He's the king. And he felt it would be very, very embarrassing, shameful, negative for the Philistines to capture the king of Israel. And so he asked to put a sword through him. Over there, there's a whole discussion. Was that permissible? Or was that a form of suicide? When we get there, we'll discuss it. So anyways, Avimelech dies, and it just ends by saying this whole incident So it says, "Vayeshev Elokim et Ra'at Avimelech asher asa la'aviv la'arog et shivim echav." So after this whole story, it says that God returned upon Avimelech all of the evil that he had done to his own father by killing all of his 70 brothers. And here we see again a classic example of Mida Keneged Mida, that God returned upon him all of this evil. So this reminds me of a story that happened to me. I was on a kosher tour to Scotland. I don't know how many years ago, 7, 8 years ago. 1 second, I think I have to sneeze. Nope, I was spared. we were in Scotland, and we had a tour guide, and he knew his history of Ireland and Scotland very, very well. He knew all the kings and all of the escapades and all the revolts, and which king killed that king and which king's son rebelled against his father. And there were a lot of intrigue. And I remember at one point, one of the people made like a negative comment, like look at this twisted history. Everyone is killing everyone else. Everyone's revolting against everyone else. And so someone piped up and said, didn't anyone learn Tanakh? Didn't anyone learn the book of Judges? We shouldn't judge so quickly. When you read the book of Kings, how many inner civil wars there were in Israel. And here, this is really a terrible incident here with Avimelech. He's not the most sympathetic person, yet it's recorded in the book of Judges. And what we can learn from this is Jewish tradition, Jewish text from the Chumash through the prophets, throughout history, the Gemara, they're very honest. You might think the Tanakh is a holy book. Why would we put in the story about Avimelech? It was really a terrible thing that happens here. We learn something from Yotam, but this just tells us that the Tanakh is honest. It has its high points, it has its low points, but we're meant to learn from everything, the good and the bad. If you remember, I'm not sure I mentioned it, but going back a few judges was Ehud. If you remember Ehud, he had a injured right arm, and it was obvious. And so he had this whole plan that he hid a sword. It was more like a knife. And he went into the enemy king pretending that he had a gift for him. It could have been that he was bringing taxes, but he made it that he was bringing a gift. And so he was allowed in to see the king. And when he approached him, he said, I have a word for you from God. And the text says that Eglon, he got up out of respect, because Ehud said, I have a message from God. And Eglon gets up. So later the sages say that there is something to learn from everyone, or in the context of what I'm trying to say, from every story in the Tanakh, there is what to learn. And so here it says that because Eglon showed tremendous respect, we could even learn from a evil king the respect that he showed to God, that he got up. And so this is part of a whole idea that in our prayers, at different junctures, when we say things which are called Devarim Shebekudusha, that you need a minion to say, that many people have the custom to always stand up during the things like Kaddish or Baruch Hu or Kedusha, different parts of the service. Not everyone does this, but even from an evil king, we have what to learn. So I'm just mentioning it because this was not a very nice story. But here we see this deep metaphor or parable that Yotam says, and it ends with God saying that eventually Avimelech got back all the evil that, not all of the evil, but he was paid back for the evil that he did. The next is a very short passage, but it mentions who became the leader of Israel after that, who was the next judge. So here it just says quickly, we don't know very much about them, but it mentions that Tola, the son of Pua, the son of Dodo, from Yisachar, he became the judge, and he judged for 23 years. And it's interesting because this is a name that we don't really recognize that much unless you're like an expert in the book of Judges. And then after that, there is a name that's very popular in Israel, is Yair. And he was from Gilad, and he was a judge for 22 years. So here we see in just a short, we call it a paragraph, a passage, 50 years of history go by, and there's hardly a word of what happens during those 50 years. But the book of Judges at least records who the two judges were. And like I said, Yair is a very popular name in Israel, whereas Tola, you don't hear very much. Okay, now we move on to a different story. 50 years have gone by, and it starts off with the same dynamic. Here we are we're now in the 10th chapter, in the 6th verse. It says, Yisifu b'nei Yisrael la'asot hara b'einei Hashem v'yavdu et ha'ba'alim v'et ha'ashtarot v'et Elokei Aram v'et Elokei Sidon v'et Elokei Moab v'et Elokei b'nei Ammon v'et Elokei Pelishtim v'yazvu et Hashem v'lo avduhu. So here it says the dynamic that we've been following the entire book of Judges, that a righteous judge will rule. In most cases, he comes to rule after Israel cries out because they've turned away from God and God has sent an enemy. And here, what I just read in Hebrew is that Israel again turned away from God. And here it says that they worshipped the what's called the Baal, one of the gods, and the Ashtarot, and the gods of Aram, and the gods of Sidon, and the gods of Moab, the gods of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. And they turned away from God. And it says that God became very angry. Again, we're talking in the language of human beings. And sends enemies again. And God actually comes and he gives rebuke to the people. He said, like, doesn't anyone remember how I took you out of Egypt? Doesn't anyone remember all of the miracles and how many times I've delivered you and brought you righteous judges, and still you turn away from me over and over again? Unfortunately, this is a dynamic that is really the main dynamic of the whole book of Judges. So again, enemies come, and the people are now again crying out to Shem, who's going to save us this time? And so they turn to a man called Yiftach. And in chapter 11, it says he was considered a mighty man of valor, but his history was he was born out of wedlock to a prostitute. And so his whole life, and his father had, we'll call it legitimate wives, and had many sons. And all of those sons like pushed this one away because it's not from their mother, it's from a prostitute, and pushed Yiftach away. And Yiftach, we'll call it, went into personal exile. And it says that interestingly, he says he lived in the land of Tov, in the land of goodness. In other words, he didn't do anything wrong. He just happened to have we'll call it the mazal, the circumstances of being an outcast to his family. And yet, he became known as a very strong leader type. And it says that he gathered around him people, kind of people who didn't fit into the box, looked to him as a leader. And so he gathered around him a whole group of people. Now it's interesting because the same dynamic is going to return in the book of Shmuel with none other than King David. That King David, we'll get to the story. I'm not going to go into it now, but King David, before he was king, he was an outcast from his family. And at a certain point, he became an outcast from Shaul, the king. But there it says the same thing. All the dissatisfied, we'll call it rebellious kind of people that didn't fit into the usual box, they gathered around David Melech. That became his core group. So the same thing here with Yiftach. He was obviously very charismatic, and he gathered these people around him. So at this point, the people of Gilad, because that's where the main enemy was coming from, up north, they turned to Yiftach. They were desperate. They turned to Yiftach and said, you lead the war against the enemies. And Yiftach says to them, all of a sudden you're turning to me? My whole life you've treated me like an outcast. All of a sudden you need me? And the people said, yes, we need you. And Yiftach said, well, if you need me, then if I fight this war and I'm successful, I will become the leader. And they agreed. They agreed that if Yiftach can pull off a victory here, he'll become the leader. So here we're in chapter 11. And there's a long dialogue here. that Yiftach sent messengers to Ammon. That was the main enemy right now. And he said to them, why are you fighting against me? What do you have to gain? Ammon answers back, you stole our land hundreds of years ago, and now we want it back. And Yiftach sends a long answer about, we didn't really take your land. We passed through it, and other people actually took your land, but then you came against us, and we were able to defeat you and the others that were gathered with you. He said, but this is hundreds of years ago. And now all of a sudden, you want us to give back what God gave to us? So this sounds very, very familiar to very contemporary issues, especially after the 6-Day War, where we were able to recapture really biblical Israel that was the homeland for thousands of years. And then it becomes, well, God gave it back to us. Now you want us to just give it back to you? After you used that land to try to defeat us, to literally end the state of Israel, and now you want us to give it back? So again, everything in the Tanakh is archetypal. And we'll use the phrase, history repeats itself. So that's what Yiftach, bottom line, says. We should give back what God gave to us. And so before he went to war, so this is in around verse 30. So this is a very, very important part of the story here. So it says, Vayidar Yiftach Neder. This is verse 30, chapter 11. Vayidar Yiftach Neder Lashem. Yiftach made a vow to God. V'yomer, im naton titen et b'nei Ammon b'yadi. If you give over the children of Ammon into my hand, in other words, if I can defeat Ammon, v'haya hayotzei asher yetzei mildalatai beiti likrati v'shuvi b'shalom b'nei Ammon v'haya l'Hashem ba'alitehu olah. So Yiftach says, so when I come back after this victory, whoever comes out of the doors of my house to greet me, I will offer it up as an offering. Now, it's obvious what Yiftach had in mind. He lived out in the country. Here, it's not clear it means literally his house, but he was surrounded with animals. And in those days, it was typical to show thanks by bringing an offering. And so here he says the first thing, meaning the first animal that runs towards me when I come back, I will offer up that animal in thanks. He goes off to war. He is successful. And then in verse 34, so it says, Vayavo Yiftach HaMitzpah El Beito. So Yiftach is returning to his house in Mitzpah. V'hinei bito yitzei likrato b'tupim u'mecholot v'rak hi yechida ein lo mimenu ben obat. So what happened? He's coming back to his house, his ranch, his area, and his daughter comes out of the door with drums and tambourines to greet him in great joy. He's this hero. He just defeated the enemy after years of oppression. And so she is so proud of her father. So she comes out to greet him. So it continues. Vayehi kira'oto ota, but when he saw her, vayikra et bigadav, he tore his clothes. Vayomer aha biti hachriya hikratani ve'et hayiti be'ocharai va'anochi patsati pi el Hashem v'lo chalashuv. He said, in essence, like, you've turned my joy into sorrow, because I've made a vow to God and I can't go back on it. So here we have it's very hard what to say, a weird situation, a crazy situation, that in Yiftach's eyes, he's now stuck by this vow he made, and he thinks he has to, as it were, offer up his daughter as an offering. So his daughter says to him, if you have made a vow, so you have to do what you promised, because you were successful. You said, if I'm successful and I can defeat Ammon, you made a vow to God that I will offer up the first thing that I see. And so she says, but do me a favor. Let me go to the mountains for 2 months, that I might wander in the mountains and cry over my virginity, I and my friends. And he said, go. He said, go. And he sent her away for 2 months. As I said before, this whole story is again, it's hard to come up with the right adjective. It's a strange thing that's going on here. We're obviously going to try to understand it. And she came back after 2 months, and it says, the words are, so it says, Vayi miketz shnayim chadashim, after 2 months, v'teshev el avia, she returned to her father, v'yas la et nidro, and he did according to his vow, asher nadar, that he had vowed to God, v'hi lo yada ish v'tehi chok b'Yisrael, and she never got married. She knew no man. Miyamim yamima telechna benot Yisrael letanot lebat Yiftach Hagiladi arba yamim b'shana. And it says, after this whole incident, that it became a custom in Israel that women, daughters, would mourn yearly for the daughter of Yiftach 4 days in the year. Just like today we have fast days to the destruction of the temple, there was a custom for not clear how long, but women would mourn over the daughter of Yiftach. Now, most people understand, even though there is actually an opinion, that one of the opinions is he actually offered her up. He killed her. He fulfilled his vow. Now, obviously, that didn't sit well with most people, their concept here, because here the whole thing is that it follows. He says, he did according to his neder, and she knew no man, and the daughters of Israel would mourn over like her virginity. So the majority opinion is that she basically became a hermit. She lived alone. She was obviously never married, was a virgin her whole life. And the story doesn't really tell what happened to her. So there's a lot of discussion about this. There's a lot of discussion. And you know what? I'll continue and we'll go back to this. Then what happens is a very similar thing that happened with Gidon. When Gidon called certain of the tribes to fight with him, at that point, he didn't call Ephraim. Then Ephraim came and complained, why didn't you call us? Why did you pass over us as if we're not important? And Gidon was able to placate them by saying that, well, once you joined us, look at the tremendous victories that you won. It was greater than anything I did. So here we saw that Gidon was very humble, and he made himself very, very small in the eyes of the tribe of Ephraim in order to maintain peace. So here, a very similar thing happens, that, again, Ephraim is complaining, and but this time he just incorporated them into the army, and they go on and they are able to defeat all of their other enemies. And then it says, towards the end of chapter 12, then it says that Yiftach, the Giladi, died and was buried in one of the cities of Gilad. And after him, Ivzan of Beit Lechem, he became the judge and he ruled and he had 30 sons and 30 daughters. And he judged for 7 years. And after him was Elon, and he ruled for 10 years. And after him was Avdon, and he ruled for 8 years. So here we see, again, we don't hear what they did, what they accomplished, but the book of Judges was careful to keep an accurate history of who were the leaders for how many years and where they were from. And they recorded it, and it ends, and that's how chapter 12 ends. So let's go back to this thing with Yiftach. Everyone understands this is like a very strange incident. And the obvious question that everyone asks is, in the book of Numbers, in Parshat Matot, we learn about making vows. That is what we'll call the headquarters of learning about making vows. Later, because of the oral tradition, many of the small details were filled in. But in the Parsha of Matot, which is the second last portion of the book of Numbers, the basics of making vows is spelled out. And it makes clear that if you make a vow, you need to keep the vow. But then it talks about what happens if a man makes a vow, he has to keep it. And if a woman makes a vow, you have to keep it. But then there's this, we'll call it an intermediate state of a young woman between the ages of 12 and 12 and a half, where halakhically it's considered we'll call it an in-between period. Many girls were married during those 6 months. And so she's no longer a girl. She's not quite a woman. There's like this halakhic time period. And there we see clearly that a father or a husband can annul a vow. And we also see that why is the parsha called Matot? Matot means the head of the tribes. It literally means a staff. A mateh is a staff, like the staff of Moshe. But it also means that the heads of the tribes are called Matot. And so Rashi tells us, why is the whole portion called after the tribes? And Rashi tells us this is to inform us that even though it's about to say, if you make a vow, you have to keep it, that if you have 3 people, they can annul a vow. We know today, to make a vow in the terms of the Torah is a very, very specific way and wording of making a vow. But maybe everyone remembers that usually right before Rosh Hashanah, we do what's called Hatarat Nedarim, the annulment of vows. And 3 people sit down. It can be any 3 kosher Jews, 3 halachic Jews. And you read this whole long thing that if I, by mistake, made a vow that I didn't realize I was making a vow, or I made a vow and I later regretted it, or like I said, I didn't even realize that I made a vow. I didn't say beli neder. I said I'm going to do something, but I didn't say without promising. Then the 3 people act as judges, and they annul the vows. And this also is part of what's the beginning of Yom Kippur. It's called Kol Nidre. Begins with this idea of vows. So in other words, without getting into the specifics, making a vow is a very important promise, and we need to keep it. But we know from the oral Torah that you can annul a vow, especially one of the easiest vows to annul is if you made a promise, but you made it in a way that you didn't realize the ramifications of what you were doing. So if you went before a court of 3 people and you say, I made this vow, but when I made it, I didn't understand what I was doing. I didn't understand the ramifications. Then they can annul the vow. So here, everyone asks, it's clear, like 100%, 1,000%, that when Yiftach made this vow, he absolutely did not have in mind that his daughter was going to come out and greet him, and therefore he would be bound by this vow. Everyone says, why didn't he just go and annul the vow? Why did he insist, I made this vow and I must keep it? And even his daughter, we have to understand, like, even to maybe 100 years ago, we don't understand, truthfully, in today's world, the respect and awe that children had for their parents. That it's not like today. I'll just leave it like that. And so here why didn't she say, what are you talking about, Abba, with all due respect, but obviously you didn't mean me, but you don't see her saying that. She even said, if you made such a vow, you have to carry it out. All she asks is, give me 2 months to mourn for my virginity. She obviously understood that he wasn't going to literally offer her up, but that something had to be sacrificed here. And somehow, even though it doesn't say in the text explicitly, she understood that the sacrifice that she could make, that her father's vow could be implemented, is she would sacrifice her getting married, and she would be a virgin her whole life. She lived in practical isolation her whole life. And in that way, she had so much respect for her father. Now, maybe in today's terms, it would be like kind of incredulous that she would go to that lengths to respect her father. But going back, everyone asks, what is wrong with Yiftach that he didn't just go to a Beit Din and annul the vow? And so here it becomes a little bit complicated. The leader, the spiritual leader of the generation was Pinchas. We've mentioned Pinchas a number of times in the book of Judges. He goes back to the book of Bamidbar. He is the one who stops the plague in the desert by killing Zimri and Cosbi. And he really saves all of Israel. It's the same Pinchas. We're told he lived a very long life. And here, Pinchas heard about this outrageous vow that Yiftach had made. And again, everyone understood it was a mistake. That's not what Yiftach had in mind. So here's what we're told by tradition, that Yiftach knew that if he went to Pinchas, he could have the vow annulled. But we have to remember, there's a little bit of a psychology here, is he was an outcast for his whole life. And here, finally, Israel turns to him and makes him their leader. He goes and he defeats the enemy. He's like on the top of the world. And he, as it were, says to himself, let Pinchas come to me. He knows about this. I'm the leader now. Let Pinchas come to me, and I'll allow him to annul the vow. Pinchas says, I'm the spiritual leader. I've been the spiritual leader for almost generations at this point, according to tradition. Yiftach is this upstart. Okay, he won this war. Let him come to me. And we're told that because of their obstinance, their pride, their stubbornness, neither one would go to the other one. And it was like Yiftach was, well, if he won't come to me, I'm not going to go to anyone else. Why should I go to just any old person to annul this vow? I'm the leader now. And Pinchas also had his pride. Let him come to me. The spiritual leader of Israel should not go to someone like Yiftach. And we're told here, all it says is Yiftach died and was buried. According to tradition, he became so sick after this. However, we understand that his limbs started falling off his body. Limb by limb, finger by finger, again, a little bit not a pleasant thing. that literally he started to what we'll call fall apart, literally, until he died. And Pinchas also died shortly afterwards. And the sages tell us that both of them were terribly wrong in their attitude. And that here, Yiftach's daughter paid the price. And again, maybe in today's terms, we could even question that she went along with this. But let's try to look at it in a positive sense of the great respect that she had for her father. And she wouldn't have even thought of going against him. Again, in today's terms, we would question that. We would say, maybe we should learn something different from this story. And that would be legitimate also. But so here we have a very complicated story with a lot of psychology behind it. And we should learn the terrible cost of pride. In this case, both of them died because of this. The tradition makes it clear that they both paid the price for their abstinence. So that brings us through chapter 12. And next week, we begin the story of Shimshon, the story of Samson, one of the most intriguing stories, not only in the book of Judges, but in the entire Tanakh, the whole story of Shimshon, which goes over many chapters. It's not clear that we'll do it in one class. I'll have to see how the preparation goes. Anyways, much to learn from the stories tonight, and may we learn these lessons well. Okay, as is our custom, we will go right into insights into the Haftorah. Welcome everyone to Insights into the Weekly Haftorah. This week's Parsha is the last portion of the book of Bereshit, Vayechi, and the Haftorah is from the first book of Kings, the second chapter, verses 1 through 12. As always, our first question is, why was this Haftorah chosen? And so here we see that in the portion of Vayechi, almost the entire portion surrounds the impending death of Yaakov. It begins by saying that Yaakov lived for 17 years in Egypt, but right away it says he was sick, and he calls for Yosef, his son, and he makes him promise to take his body for burial in Israel, in Marat Machpelah, where Avram and Sarah buried, where Yitzhak and Rivka is buried, and where Leah is buried. But in making Yosef promise, he reviews the whole history of him and Rachel, and kind of tells the whole story. And then Yosef brings his two sons to get a blessing from Yaakov, and then Yaakov, pretty much on his deathbed, gives blessings to all of his sons, and then he passes away, and they bring his body to Israel for burial. So obviously, we would expect the Haftorah have to do with someone about to die and their, call it their last will and testament. And that's exactly what this is. And it begins, Vayikravu Yemei David Lamut. And the days of David came close for him, it came near for him to die. But Yitzavit Shlomo Beno Lemor, and he gave over, we'll call it his last will and testament to Shlomo, his son. What's interesting here is that of the last 4 or 5 haftarahs, 3 of them have to do with Shlomo, David and Shlomo. If you go back to Chai Sarah, that talks about the death of Sarah. So the haftarah is about David is very, very sick, and he is nearing his death. And that's the whole intrigue, that his son rebels and declares himself king. And the prophet God and Bathsheba come to David and say, but you promised that Shlomo would become king. And it goes through that whole incident. In the end, David does promise that Shlomo is my chosen inheritor. Then, just 2 parshes ago in Miketz, it talks about Paro waking up from a dream. And the Haftorah is about Shlomo waking up from a dream. And the famous incident where he judges between the 2 women who are arguing over one son is alive and one son is dead. And then this week, again, it's about Shlomo. So just interesting that David and Shlomo are chosen as the Haftarah. So in this week's Haftarah, we see something very, very beautiful, because when it says that David commanded his son Shlomo, so here we see something that we didn't see by Yaakov. Yaakov gave blessings, and but here David gives over more like advice, and he's basically telling him, keep the Torah, be close to God, do the mitzvot, and everything will be good for you. And it's your obligation as king to give this example to the people. And the words are very, very beautiful. The Hebrew is actually quite simple. As we've talked about, sometimes in the books of the prophets, the language is a very difficult Hebrew. Here, the Hebrew is very simple and direct. And he just tells all these beautiful, beautiful advice of how he should conduct himself as an individual who is the king. So he has to be an example to everyone. And then the second part of the Haftorah is people ask questions about it. Here, David has just given over this beautiful advice to his son. And then he mentions 2 people who crossed David in David's lifetime. And he explains to Shlomo what they did to him. And though he doesn't say it explicitly, he says to him, you're a very wise person. I have to understand, Shlomo was 12 years old when he became king. But he said to him already, he said, you are a wise person, and you'll know what to do with these 2 people, that you won't allow them to go to the grave in peace. He does not come out and say you should kill them, but he's hinting that both of them actually halachically deserve the death penalty. And the first case is Yoav. Yoav was David's general through most of David's life. He was a very strong personality, Yoav, and he was very, very successful. And David very much depended on him. He was a tremendous general. David, we're told, fought 18 different wars, 18 different enemies at different times. And he was successful. And a lot of it was because of Yoav. But in two cases, which is mentioned here, only when we get to the book of Shmuel will we learn all the details. But in two cases, Avner killed what he felt were enemies of David. But in both cases, they were coming to make peace with David. And Avner went ahead and killed them. And again, we'll learn this at a different time, the details. But David back then was very upset. And he made it clear to Avner, is in a certain way, you're gonna have to pay for this. You killed two people that you shouldn't have killed, and the blood is on your hands. And the second one is, and let me mention someone that you should be good to, and that is Barzillai. Barzillai was a friend of David. He was very, very humble. He loved David, not because he was after power. They were just really good friends. And David, who had so many opponents, so many enemies, he always appreciated that he had this person that he could really depend on, who wasn't looking for favors, wasn't looking for money. It was just, they had just a great relationship. So he says to Shlomo, make sure to take care of Barzillai. Be good to him because he was good to me. And then the other person, and this is more complicated, was Shimi ben Gera. When his son Avshalom rebelled against him, David in two cases had sons trying to overthrow him. And Avshalom was his dear son. And David had to flee from Avshalom. And for a while, Avshalom took the kingdom. And David wanted the kingdom back, but he didn't want anything to happen to Avshalom, his son. But Shimei at one point comes and curses David, like really, really heavy curses. Later, he came and he apologized. But in a certain way, the deed was done. And that already, because he was still the king, he could have killed or have killed Shimei on the spot. He had that prerogative, and he didn't. But again, he said to Shlomo, you'll know what to do. And so, to make a long story short, we'll get to it at a later time, is Shlomo said to Shimei, he knew the whole story here. He said to him, as long as you stay in Yerushalayim, nothing will happen to you. I give you safety. But if you ever, it was like a city of refuge. He gave him refuge. He said, but if you ever leave Yerushalayim, the blood will be on your hands. And eventually he did leave Yerushalayim. And Shlomo then had, as it were, his, we'll call it excuse, or his reasoning from his own father that Shimei had to pay a price that he could have, should have paid a long time ago. So many people, and then it says, and then David passes away, and he was buried in the city of David. Now, the city of David is not exactly what we call Jerusalem today. It was the lower part of where Sichon spring is, the Mei Shiloach. And he was buried somewhere there. Today, there is a place on Mount Zion that by tradition is the burial place of David HaMelech. Some say yes, most say no. But we do know that he's buried very close to there. This happens many times. There are many great sages or rabbis, we know exactly where they're buried. And others, we know that they're in the area. So it's not clear that David is buried exactly where by tradition he's buried. I should mention, just one second. I should mention that my wife and I were married, I say my wife is online, on the roof of King David's tomb. That's where we're married, in Mount Zion, a very, very holy place, very holy place. That's where we were married. So the Haftorah ends that David passes away. He's buried in the city of David. And then it says, David ruled over Israel for 40 years, 7 in Hebron, the first 7 years, and the last 33 years in Jerusalem. So all told, he ruled for 40 years. David passes away, and the Haftorah ends by saying, Ushlomo yeshav al kisei David. Shlomo sat on the throne of David, Aviv, his father, v'tiken malchuto ma'od, and he established his kingship very strongly. He is 12 years old, but when he took over, immediately he established his kingdom and he ruled until he passed away. Interestingly enough, he also ruled for 40 years. By tradition, he was 52 when he passed away. He was 12 when he took over. So he also ruled for 40 years. May we be blessed to see the son of David, the son of Shlomo, Mashiach ben David, soon and in our days.